most of what I've done is military history, and my latest book is my first true crime work, and actually working on another military history work. My next project will be a book on my uncle who served in the Air Force. He was a navigator of a fighter interceptor, and unfortunately, he was ordered to eject when he was too low over the ocean. And modern day ejector seats work so well that you can eject while sitting on a runway standing still, and a rocket motor will shoot you up so high that your chute will open, you'll live, you'll be fine. But back then, the way it worked is there was an explosive shell that shot you up,
Oh,
and there was a limit to how much force they could use to force you up, because if it was too much of an explosion, you could suffer a spinal injury or even have a severed spine. So the theory back then was, let's just push the guy up high enough so that the plane could pass under him without hitting him. But what that meant was that you had to be of a certain height for there to be time to be a chute to be open. And unfortunately, when my uncle was ordered to eject, he didn't realize he was right along the top of the ocean, and his chute never opened, and his neck just broke when he hit the ocean.
but they never found his body either, huh?
They didn't, and just recently, I was in contact with a diving outfit called Atlantic Divers in New Jersey, and Gene Patterson. I have to give the gentleman a plug. I'm so honored. He's actually said he's willing to go searching for my uncle's jet, and if they could find his jet, they might be able to find his remains, which would be great for my family.
Wow, they never found the jet, huh? I mean, it's
They
just
never
right there off the
found him.
coast of America. That's interesting.
It is what I spoke to someone at the Air Force, and what they told me is that then and even today, it's just so expensive to go looking for jets that usually they don't even bother. They just let them sit down in the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah, maybe, yeah, what are they going to do with them? They're going to salvage them, right? Barely have any equipment in them as far as the military is concerned.
I think
They
you're
bare
right.
bones those things.
Yeah, I think you're right. Once they're in the bottom of seawater, that's it.
Exactly. I mean, even those multi-million-dollar planes, I don't know. I guess they collect every single scrap of those, top secret
Right,
schematics
right.
and all that stuff. What makes your uncle's death so particularly sensitive to you?
Well, the thing is, he was, I guess you could say, the golden boy of my family. And my mom and her other brother and her sister, they all did very well in life. And like all siblings, they have, I don't know, do you have any siblings, Brian?
I do. Yeah, I do.
Okay, so I'm sure you'll agree. Siblings have differences, and my mom's family, those siblings had differences too. But one thing they all agreed upon is that my uncle Howard was the guy who was going to go the furthest in life. And I never met him, but everything I've learned about him in my research, he was really an amazing guy. My mom described him as a type of person who was pretty much good at everything and wanted to be the best at everything he did. And he was pretty amazing. When he was a little kid, he was a yo-yo champion. I have his patches that he won, in the 1940s from all these amazing tricks he could do. And
So
when
how does
he,
does there a crime that you think took place, or just writing about the Air Force, or the is it the Air Force or the Army Air Corps at that time?
well, it was the Air Force. It wasn't a true crime. It was, I, I think that the big catch, so to speak, is the tragedy of it.
The tragedy.
The tragedy of it, yeah, because he was a guy who just had endless potential, and he accomplished so much in his short life, and his ultimate career goal was politics, and it's just something to think how far he could have gone. But what happened was, basically, the pilot who was flying his jet, he was the navigator. If any of your listeners will remember the movie Top Gun, the guys who sat in the back seat looked at the radar, that was my uncle. The pilot actually flew the plane into the ocean.
Your uncle was Goose.
He was Goose,
My
exactly.
God.
You got it. That's it. That's it. But see, that's another twist on the story. He wanted to be a jet pilot, in which case he would have been flying, but he had an inner ear problem that disqualified medically for flying. So he ended up being a navigator, which he sat in the back seat. And what happened was they were sent up to identify an unidentified plane coming in, and their job was to make sure that the Russians weren't sending their bombers in to attack us on a surprise attack. And what happened was, they were flying so low, a dark night. The pilot didn't wasn't watching his altimeter, and he actually skimmed the plane just on top of the ocean. And the sound he heard made him think that the plane was exploding. So he gave my uncle the order to eject, and he punched out. The pilot then tried to punch out. but he hadn't pulled out the safety pin before he took off, which he was supposed to. So his ejection seat didn't fire, and his plane actually came to a stop in the ocean, and he was able to climb out, get in a raft, and be picked up at sea. But unfortunately, my uncle, he punched out, and within seconds, he slammed into the water, still strapped in his ejection seat, and went straight down to the bottom.
Did you serve in the military yourself?
I didn't. I didn't. I have attrition in my family. I thought about doing it, but the thing is, I would have, if I would have went into done it, it would have been just at the time when the Cold War was winding down, and at that point, it wasn't really a good career choice because there was so many cutbacks in the military. It would have
Yeah,
been a
that was my military, honestly. Bill
oh, that
Clinton.
was when you were in too, yeah.
It was devastating, honestly. And I just had the realization as well how small of a piece of the puzzle I was. My
Right.
only purpose was to collect bullets, either to
Yeah.
deliver to people who are going to take them into their bodies or make other people die, or
Right.
I mean, it's a horrible machine, honestly.
So you were
Um,
in logistics, I guess, Bryan?
I was a truck driver, yeah,
Oh, okay.
truck driver for the 101st, honestly, which is interesting because Hero, you mentioned in your article, he wrote a few histories about the United States Army.
Okay.
He was from Hopkinsville, Kentucky, which is right outside of Fort Campbell.
Who's that you're referring to?
Oh man,
You
of
had me.
course you. Let's see.
You had me confused with someone else.
You're Patrick Bowmaster, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
I did Kentucky though. I don't.
Let me see.
I read on a
Kaufman,
Virginia.
Edward
Oh,
Kaufman.
okay. Yes, yes. I know. I love that book. Yes, that was an incredible book. Yes, yes. I was asked by another interviewer, my favorite book, and the thing
Yeah.
is, I read a lot of I can't really read a lot of fiction because I have to read so much nonfiction for my research. But when I was asked for my favorite book, I mentioned that book because it's just a brilliant uh, history book on the army before the Civil War. It's just a great book. I recommend it to everyone. It's wonderful if you're into that type of thing, so to speak.
Yeah, totally. I looked it up. The date range is fantastic, 1784 to 1898. So it actually covers what directly after the Revolutionary War and then right before the turn of the century, which, if you know history, is right before World War One, right?
Right, right.
It's a great period in warfare. But it says what the thing that really gets me about the title is it's a portrait of the American army in peacetime. And we know there were wars during that time. The Battle of the War of 1812. There was the West Spanish American War. There was the Civil War. There were major, major conflicts. But he calls it peacetime. I'm so curious. I want to read it right now. I almost bought it.
Well, well, what is kind of interesting is that I guess from his perspective is that there are so many books out there that will teach you about the army during the war that he wants to fill the gap and show you that what life was like for soldiers when there wasn't
When there wasn't a war, yeah, because it's a totally
yeah,
different
yeah,
animal.
yeah.
If you're in the war, if you're in an army now, post Afghanistan, it's still Afghanistan, right?
Right.
It's totally different than when I was in, or what it would be in 10 years if we had like 10 years of peace.
Absolutely. And thank you for your service, by the way, Bryan.
What are you going to thank me for?
Well, I mean, I tip my hat to you because I didn't put my butt in harm's way. So you're a better man than I am.
You know what? I had a drill sergeant. What is it? The cliche is thank your congressman. I
Oh,
mean,
is that it?
honestly,
For sending you there, you mean?
no, just thank your congressman because they gave you the opportunity to be here. I mean, it's all bullshit, right? From the beginning to
Yeah.
the end, you're basically trying to protect something that you had nothing to do with, really. Man, these poor kids, they come back just broken in most cases,
It is sad. But
and
you're
they're
still a
just thrown
brave
away.
guy, though, Bryan, because you're willing to do it. A lot of you're still brave, though.
Yes, right. I mean, you put your nose in there, you take a shot, you
Right.
get a couple shots thrown back at you. That's life. And that's what we're talking about with your uncle too, in a way. I mean, the one thing that struck me the most is you said that he was expected to go, you know, so far, but he went high, right? I mean, he went higher than anybody else can in the military. A fighter pilot or a pilot in general is like the cream of the crop. You can't get a better job.
Well, see, that's something that I found interesting in my research is that, I mean, even today, I guess most people consider, flying in a jet to be a hot job, right? and he originally wanted to be a pilot, and this was in the 1950s. And today, I mean, it's still a dangerous job today to be a fighter pilot, but back then, I mean, jets were medieval in the technology. They
Yeah.
were so bloody dangerous. I mean, I've done the research. I think anytime you went up in a jet at that time, you had to have I forget my language. You had to be stones, like you just couldn't believe it. You had to have a
Right.
head on you, as my dad said.
You
My dad
still
would
do
say,
though. My God, man.
yeah,
I watched what is it? The Angels. Blue Angels? What are
Blue
they
Angels.
called? Yeah, the Blue Angels, man. They have to huff. They have to do like crunches while they're sitting in their seat or they'll pass out. It's
That's
like
pretty.
they do this like use. It's like there's like it just sounds like it's painful, and that they're doing it for hours. You know what I mean? They're not just doing it from 3 seconds. They're doing it for hours so they don't pass out. It's incredible the
I
amount of
totally
stress
agree.
they put their body on, or
They
their
got
body
guts.
in
They got guts. I agree. I agree.
guts.
And
And then
back
at the end of
then,
the day,
go ahead. I'm
was
sorry.
no, what were you gonna say?
No, I was going to say, and you're right, and you're right. It's still dangerous today, but the thing that's interesting is I found out that the first American-made jet to fly was only 1948. So in 1958,
Made really?
in 1948, yeah, the first one. I mean, the British invented the jet, and of course the Germans had a jet fighter in World War II. But the first American designed and built jet was not until 1948. So when my uncle
It's interesting.
decided that he wanted to go in ROTC in 1952. I mean, I admire the guy for guts to wanting to be a pilot, and later to even more guts, I think, to be a navigator. Because if you're a navigator, you're trusting the guy in the front
Yeah.
seat with your life,
Yeah,
and
and you have to
that
keep
takes a
your
lot.
eye on what do you do during combat though? A navigator, you're dropping bombs mostly, right? But there might be a dogfight situation. What are you going to do? Sit there and just wait it out? Or is there something you physically have to do during a dogfight scenario?
Well, well, you're absolutely right. They over the years they've kind of changed that job title, and one of the things they now call it, I think, is like weapons systems officer or operator. Well, you're right. Part of the job would be you control the weapons, but back in my uncle's time in the 50s, it was different.
Yeah.
What he would do is that he was his job in his squadron was that they had radar systems set up, and every plane who flew then or now, you had to file a flight plan so that everyone knew exactly where you were going. And if
Hmm.
you were where you weren't supposed to be, radar would pick you up, and they got to make sure you're not a nuclear bomber ready to destroy New York City or Washington D.C. So they would have to scramble within, I think, within 2 minutes or 5 minutes. You had to run to your jet, be up in the air, and be flying towards that plane to identify it. So my uncle's job was he would check his radar and he would give directions to the pilot so they would intercept the jet coming in and make sure it's not a threat. And if it's not a Soviet plane, they would say you land right now because you're in trouble. And that's what they would do, because you were in big trouble if you didn't fly your flight plan for obvious reasons. But it's very dangerous work because any weather, night or day, if there was a plane that was caught on that radar, they had to go up and investigate it. It was
It's a
very
wild,
dangerous.
wild west of air flight too. I mean, in terms of commercial airlines and even the military. I did not know that we didn't have our own produced airplanes during World War II. We were flying the British version all the way through that entire conflict,
Well, World War One, definitely. You're right.
World
We
War
had,
One. But
yeah,
1948 would be after World War II.
right. Well, I mean, World War Two, we had planes like the Mustang, which was a really good fighter. We had some good
Was that
planes.
American produced though, or was that
That was
produced?
American produced, yeah.
Oh, okay.
We early on, you're right. Early on in the war, it was embarrassing as far as our aircraft. That's why one of the reasons why the Japanese in Pearl Harbor, people were amazed by what a great plane the Zero was. But once we got up to speed, we did start to produce some pretty good aircraft, some pretty good bombers, some pretty good fighters. The Mustang was pretty incredible. But you're right, though, Brian. We were behind in jet technology. That's why I said it wasn't until 1948, which was 3 years after the war, that we finally had
Oh,
a
and I
jet
think the
fighter.
terminology jet is the most important word there, isn't it? I'm not thinking that we flew jets during World War II. The Mustangs weren't jets; they were those prop
No,
planes. Yeah.
exactly. You're right. You're
Oh,
right.
that's what I'm
That's
confusing
smart.
myself with. That's the terminology between the actual mechanics or the machine itself, I guess.
Right.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So the jet, 1950 or 1948. So that's the first like on its way to being supersonic, a decade away from being supersonic.
Okay, so supersonic would be okay. So break the speed of sound. When I guess
Yeah.
when did Chuck Yeager break the speed of sound?
So I'm
That
wondering,
was
let's see, 50 something, or was it,
I
it
think
wasn't
it
the
was 50, it
60s,
was 50 something. Yeah, it was definitely 50
56 or
something.
earlier?
That sounds
Find out.
about right. That sounds about right. But my uncle's plane couldn't do that. I mean, it was so. It was as I said. It was. I interviewed one of the men from his squadron who described it as medieval in terms of jet technology. It was super dangerous plane. And the thing is, my mom remembers that my uncle told the family that the men in the squadron were actually afraid of the plane. I mean, they did not trust their lives to it because early on there had been so many accidents and so many men died because again, the technology was just so new. You know, they didn't know enough about aerodynamics. They were making it up as they go along, and a lot of men died, unfortunately.
Yeah, Chuck Yeager was 1953. So, I mean, really, this technology is being tested at the same time as it's being utilized.
Right,
I mean, I
right.
think it's all stolen German technology too, right? I mean, they got the German scientists after World War II to work on rocketry, and rocketry is basically jets,
You,
kind of.
you're you're very right. That was one of the interesting stories about World War II. It was the race between us and the Soviets to who was going to grab all the scientists who had that technology. And I know even to capture the German jet fighter was a great prize that everyone was scrambling to get as many as they could of the surviving examples.
So fascinating, man. That war and the one before it as well were so important to get us to where we are technologically. Even the Cold War, the one that was winding down while you were coming of age and could have joined the military. It was a very boring time, honestly. We had
Yeah,
the worst uniforms. You know, the woodland camouflage was so horrible. um, and we had no wars to fight. We did Bosnia. Bosnia was like nothing.
right, right. Is that the one that you were involved in, Brian?
No, I was never involved in a war, thankfully.
Oh, okay.
Thankfully, I got out before 9/11, a few years actually,
Ah,
and I wonder how life would have worked otherwise. You know, because it's these conflicts have been horrible.
yeah,
We can kill
it's
people so
rough.
effectively. We can just murder them so easily with what we have,
Isn't that something? Yeah,
right?
it's a rough thing. It really is. It's rough. It's when I
Comparably, like the people that we kill compared to who dies on our side, it's so small, but it's so impactful because it's like 50,000 wounds are coming back that will never be healed. We're talking like lost eyes and legs and arms and things that, like in World War II or Vietnam, would have been deaths. You know what I mean? These poor kids are coming back patched up, barely surviving, but they're surviving.
I mean, you're right. That's one of the things that I've read about that. If you look about the how uh, the percentage of people who were wounded and survived, and you're right. Nowadays, it's really high. But I mean, you're right. You make a really good point. You have guys coming back who have just horrible injuries who not too long ago would have died from their injuries. And obviously, thank God they're alive. But you're right. You have soldiers having to deal with these horrific injuries who in the past would have died and not have to live with that type of stuff. It's war's terrible, obviously.
And we're seeing a lot of it now, how they're living with it. I mean, it's hard. Oh man, I read a story, happened upon this story about a soldier that came back. I think he was from Wisconsin. And he was terribly disfigured, and he ended up marrying the girl that he was engaged to before he left. And she was miserable under the circumstances, you know?
Yeah.
And they ended up divorced a few months later, and he fell on ice and died. I mean, it was like
Oh,
the whole thing was a tragedy, but it just made me kind of think of these veterans coming home nowadays, and even back then, you know what I mean? In terms of that peacetime army that you are interested in. I'm interested in it too. I'd love to read that book. So fascinating. What did we do during peacetime during those errors?
one thing that's interesting about is Brian is that I mean today I'm grateful that most people really appreciate people like yourself who serve because as I said you signed up, you were willing to to put your butt on the line. So as I said, you're a better man than I am, and people respect people like you. But the thing is, believe it or not,
But you don't know though, do you?
what do
I
you mean?
mean, you like back in the 60s and the 70s, you had people dodging the draft, not going to Vietnam.
Yeah,
At the end of the day, you have to respect what they were doing as well because they ended the draft. They gave people the freedom to choose and they created a more, I don't know, stronger military, stronger country in a way. So, I mean, you have to thank them as well, and they didn't serve.
you know what though, Brian? My parents like are in the 80s, and I had a really in-depth conversation with them about that one day, and I said to them, who ended the Vietnam War? Because most people, when you think of what ended the Vietnam, you say it was, the hippie, and I shouldn't say, I don't mean that derogatory, but the hippie war protesters. And my parents who were alive then, what they said is that when that although the symbol of the 60s is the hippies were never more than a tiny percent of the population. And what really ended the draft and the war is when the non-hippies said, okay, enough's enough, it's over. So the hippies kind of get credit for doing it, but according to at least my parents' perspective, it was the people who had 9 to 5 jobs and went to work and did all the stuff that, to contribute to society. When those people said, okay, this is it, knock it off, that's when the draft and the war ended. It's just their perspective. But anyway, whatever that's worth.
It's worth the lives that were spent up to that point, right?
Yeah, that's
I
true.
mean,
That's
it's
true.
just the worst thing when you pay taxes that you know that you're putting at least a penny into a bomb.
Yeah.
That and that should be devastating in a way, right? When you read the newspaper or you dig deeper into the Syrian war or this, that, and the other thing, and an army ranger dies. I mean, that price tag to send that dude over there is like $1 million.
You're right. And the training that goes into a specialist like that is crazy. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The price tag just goes higher and higher and higher, and all of that is footed by us. I mean, we're paying the cost on all of this stuff. We have this huge. I mean, I can't help but think about Eisenhower, right, and his warning, beware of
Right.
the military-industrial complex and whatnot, because you look around and it's scary, isn't it? I mean, what they've done, what they've managed to do. You talk about, I'm just in terms of answering that, graciousness that I served or whatever. I mean, this thing that's around us since World War II is scary as hell.
I agree with you. And you're right. And the fact that Eisenhower coined that phrase means obviously you got to take it seriously because this wasn't some, anti-military person. It was Eisenhower, for heaven's sake. And
It
it's the
was the
fact,
military-industrial complex,
right.
right?
I was
I
gonna
mean, he
say,
was like saying, "Dude, we got your asses. We got
right.
our hands are around your throat. Do you see what's happening?" And then he
You're
dies.
right. It's real. You're right. It's real. For someone like him to say it, then you know it's real. And
Right?
you're right. It's definitely it is a business in a way. I hate to say it, but it really is. And
Really
it's
is.
true. It's true. And
NASA. I mean, all you have to do is go to NASA and look at how they're distributed across the country. I mean, politicians are like, "We want a piece of this for our district. We want money here, there, and this other place." I mean, it's like this buildup of. I mean, it could be easily consolidated, right? It doesn't have to be all over the place, but it's political and it costs money and it's confusing. And as a soldier, you look at it and you realize there are so many pieces above you directing where you're going to point your weapon that they probably don't even care where you point your weapon as long as nobody's pointing the weapon at them.
that's true. That's true. And I've been reading lately how a lot of people saying now that so many of the top generals get there really because they're politicians more than that they're
Yeah.
good at the job, which is even more sad.
Was thinking about Truman too the other day, how he screwed up McCarthy, how he pulled McCarthy out of the Korean War and destroyed his political clout, right? Here's a guy that after World War II could have done anything. He was
Right.
Eisenhower for the Pacific Theater, basically,
Right. Right.
and he was destroyed. And you start putting the pieces together because Eisenhower comes right into that presidential election and wins, the one that McCarthy probably would have been a part of. He was a part of that, but he didn't have any political clout. He was already lost because of what Truman did to him, the worst president in modern history, not counting the ones in the last couple decades.
Yeah, he definitely. Yeah, you're right. MacArthur. Yeah, he definitely finished MacArthur's career. He crushed him.
Killed it.
That's for sure. Yeah, you're
Killed
right.
it,
You're right
right?
about
I mean,
that.
these people, they were playing a political game right there. They still do.
That's true. Very true.
So you are writing currently a story about your uncles plane crash, or has that been written and you're ready to send it out into the world?
Well, the thing is, I've been very fortunate in my career as a writer in that I've been able to find a publisher for everything that I've written, and I'm not naive enough to believe that that will always continue. I'm sure sooner or later I won't be able to say that anymore. But because so far it's worked out for me, my plan right now is to actually finish writing the manuscript before I find a publisher. And I have chapter one very close to being finished. I may change my mind and decide to get a publisher, but I'm just confident that I'll be able to publish it. That I think I might actually finish the whole book. Um, I'll be very embarrassed if I don't find a publisher if I spend all this time, but I think that's what I'm going to do is get the whole thing done before I find a publisher.
How in depth are you going to get? Do you have a word count
Well,
in mind?
you know what? I'd like several hundred pages is what I'd like to do, and I'd like something that's heavily illustrated. One of the things I think is interesting about the story is that because he died when he was 22, my grandparents saved pretty much every piece of paper and artifact connected with him that had any significance whatsoever,
Yeah.
which is kind of interesting. So I think that a heavily illustrated book would be great because I can tell his life not only through words, but also through pictures. I mean, I have an
Mm,
incredible photograph collection from infancy through when he died in the Air Force. I have, as I said, I have his championship yo-yo patches he won when he was a kid. I have all the college and high school varsity letters he earned.
it's crazy,
I
man.
have,
He just got started. Just got started. 22 years old. Just fresh out of what? You said he went to Queens College?
he did. It was fresh out of ROTC. You know, he had 2 years in the Air Force. He had 1 year left, and I said his plan was just to get out of there. He wanted to go to Harvard Law School and then go into politics, and it was his whole life was ahead of him, and it was just taken away like that quickly.
How would you write it? So, I mean, I am a big fan of the Truman Capote, was it True Crime? Is that the name of his book?
Right.
It
The
was True Crime.
nonfiction novel.
So freaking good. So good in how that was written. Would you do this similarly where you would have a narrative kind of spreading into this event that occurs at his 22nd year where he dies? How
Well,
would you tell this story? How are you
the,
telling this story?
Well, the thing is, this is something new for me because I mean, I was trained as a historian, so I've always tried to write in a way that anyone who has average intelligence and educational level can understand. So I write for popular audiences, but I'm still true to my historian training is that I've never written in the first person. I'm always just telling the story as kind of a detached narrator. But for this book, I'm going to do something different. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tell part of it in the first person and
Mhm.
I'm going to explain not only writing his life, I'm going to explain my journey into researching his life. And by doing it that way, I can talk about how I go about discovering his life, the insights that I get into it, the insights that I see into my own life when I think about his life, and even so far in my research, there's some really interesting things that can come up. The two legislatures from the city of New York issued a proclamation honoring his service, which I was very honored. That's I think would make for a good story. There's a local American Legion post in Queens who had a special ceremony last Memorial Day where they invited our family down and they had a speech and they gave a flag to my mom in honor of his death. Um, and then, of course, I'm hoping they'll be able to find his remains. So I think telling the story in the first person would be really compelling because I'm discussing my journey into learning his life. And again, I'm also discovering things about myself along the way.
Does he count as a Korean era combat soldier?
See,
Or
that's a good question, Brian. That's something that has kind of rankled my family is that he died between Korea and Vietnam.
between? Okay.
And what that means is that literally all he ever got from the government in recognition for his service was a piece of paper saying he signed, he served honorably, and a death payment. I forget what it was, but it was enough to help the
Yeah,
family
insurance. Everybody
buy a
gets it.
house. Right. But he got no Purple Heart. He got no campaign medal.
Yeah, there's no war.
He got no anything, and I understand that he wasn't in a combat zone. I totally get that. I understand it's not the same as if he died fighting in Korea. But the thing is, he volunteered to have about the most dangerous job you could have in the Air Force. Because I said he was a fighter interceptor in all weather, night and day. Within a couple minutes, he had to run to his plane, jump in, be up in the air, and identify a plane. The night he died, it was over the Atlantic Ocean. It was pitch dark. Um, and that's why the pilot wasn't even court-martialed, because it was expected. Every time you went up, you were risking your life, and although he didn't die in a war zone, he volunteered to do something really, really dangerous. He was putting his life on the line to protect our country, because his job was to make sure the Soviets never sent nuclear bombers over to attack us. So it's a little bit of a sore spot in my family that he never got any recognition.
I mean, honestly, we haven't been at peace since World War II. We've been in a prolonged combat state since then. Even at Fort Campbell, I ran support missions all the time for 5th Group Special Forces, and they were going all over the world killing people. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Directly touching boxes that ended up being, necessary to battle people and make people believe what we want them to believe.
You're right. And you know what's sad? I had a professor who once said that, I forget the number. He said, though, that the amount of days that the world has been at peace since, civilization, it's so small. It's just sad. I hate to say it, but it's almost as if warfare is almost the normal. Not that that's a good thing. I'm not saying we should like that. We should hate that. But unfortunately, I think it's just part of our evolution and our
Oh my God,
genetics.
man,
I
it's so
mean,
interesting too. I don't know where you come from anthropologically in terms of your beliefs, but there's a great book named Homo Sapiens. I'm not going to pronounce the author's name because I'll destroy it. Are you familiar with it? Homo Sapiens, basically telling the story of us from our beginnings to present day.
Okay, tell me about it.
Well, he suggests that the whole reason that we build fences and that we have armies and that we protect our women is for wheat. Wheat has us completely in control. Everything
Huh.
that we do is to protect our crops, is to protect and nurture our food sources. Once we were able to settle down and start growing this thing and make it what we wanted to make it, moving away from it made it impossible. I mean, if we left for a year and came back, we'd have to start all over again. So you build an army to protect your farms. You build an army to protect your levees or whatever have you, your aquifers or whatever. And and that's basically where it starts, right? That's where you get your spear from, and then your clubs or whatever, you get your martial warfare and abilities, just trying to protect your food sources and your next generation of farmers, which is going to come from your wife.
I think it's very persuasive. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Love it. It was a great book. I'm kind of reading both of them at the same time. He wrote a sequel called Homo Deus, and it's talking about how food right now is just calorie dense, and we're so obese, and and things are happening along those lines. And we don't have to war anymore. We don't have to go to war. We hire Mexicans to go to war for us now. We don't have to actually take our weapons in our hands. We offer citizenship in place of doing it ourselves. You know what I mean?
Right.
We're conscripting our military to foreign powers. And if I know my history, I know Rome did that. And what happened to Rome? It fell, right?
Beginning of the end. Yeah. Yeah, you might be right. Maybe that's a bad sign of things to come. You're right.
I mean, I don't want to do it. I'm old now. I'm broken. I've already done it. I know you don't want to do it. You know what I mean? You don't want to see your kids do it either.
No,
I don't want to
you're
see
right.
my boy go out there and take a bomb under this truck or whatever and have be blown to bits and pieces. I mean, how horrible would that be? Send other people to do that stuff. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it?
It is.
Because I mean, your uncle did volunteer to do something incredibly dangerous.
He did. I said he was ROTC, and another thing that's I think is interesting about the time is that I think a lot of people don't realize that, or I should say, I think a lot of people would assume that when the Korea War ended, the draft ended. Well, that's actually not true.
Oh, drafted until 1978.
It kept on, right? So when my uncle, went into college, if he didn't go into ROTC, he might have been drafted, and so part of the reason I think why he went
Could have had bone spurs too, though.
Oh, you mean to get out of it for a physical reason?
Yeah. I mean,
Well, anyway,
there were ways to defer it. I mean, somebody who was in college could have deferred it. You know what I mean? At that point, he could have done it for
yeah,
educational reasons.
yeah, I'm
But if
not.
you're
Yeah,
an RTC,
I think
you're
you're
already
right.
volunteering. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm saying like ROTC just makes it evident that he was going. He was aiming in that direction.
I think that's who. I think that I think what he figured is that, well, if I don't join ROTC, then as soon as I graduate, again, I don't know the law. I think you're probably right. I guess it would have been he would have been allowed to stay in school, but I think as soon as he graduated, he would have been going in, and the choice is either I could not join ROTC and I could join the army and maybe be on the front line and be shot out, or I could do this really cool thing, which like
Yeah.
any 21-year-old kid, I could fly jets, which,
Right.
back in the 1950s, that's Buck Rogers stuff. I mean, it's
Right.
cool today, but back then it was
Absolutely.
even more cool. Back then it was like being
Exactly.
an
The
astronaut.
call to adventure is strong.
Right.
And you know what? That dude probably spent more than half a decade fantasizing about how to make it happen. Did you read Scott Kelly's book, detailing his year on the space station? I can't remember what it was
No,
called.
I didn't. The astronaut, you mean, right? No, I didn't. Tell me about it.
Well, he's an incredible dude. I mean, he put his mind to so many different things to achieve the goal of being a spaceman, and that's what your uncle comes from, this stock of people who just kind of make things like that would be impossible, walls that prevent people from going forward. They climb over them.
That's
I
very
mean,
nice of you to say. Thank you.
right? I mean, it would be a call. It wouldn't be like, oh, I need to salute the flag, whatever you need. No, he aimed to be a pilot, right? And that was his dream. That was his aspiration.
He did. That's what he wanted to do. I mean, at a time, when it was incredibly dangerous. I mean, he that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to, as my mom said, he always wanted to be the best at everything he did. And someone like that, I could imagine you want to be a jet pilot because just a further way to distinguish yourself. And I
Yeah,
think your listeners listen to this. I don't know if you could kind of think back to 1950s. Jets were, this new amazing technology that was people were just mesmerized by. I mean, it's still pretty darn cool today, but back then it was even more so when we went from propeller planes to flying 400 or 500 miles in the air on a jet. It was just, I said, it was Buck Rogers stuff.
yeah.
And
Pull your mic closer to your mouth. I think you're a bit faint on me again.
how's that?
That's
I'll do it. How's that?
perfect.
Okay, sorry.
No problem. Yeah, I mean, yeah, Buck Rogers stuff. I mean, they didn't know how dangerous it was either, did they? I mean, if you tell me that I'm riding a propeller plane versus a jet, I don't care necessarily. I'm not probably going to know all the people that are dying in 1952.
Well,
It's
you're
just
right.
such
That's a
thing as
good
the internet.
point. I don't know. I
It's
don't
all
know
top
how much.
secret, isn't it? I mean, the whole thing with the Nevada Proving Grounds or over there flying their thing out in California, they weren't like sending telegrams going, people are dying. I mean, that stuff was like top secret. People weren't dying. People weren't up in the air going almost Mach 1.
Right.
That wasn't happening. They didn't want Russia to find stuff out like that.
That is a good point. I don't know how much would have been publicized in the research in the newspapers. But one of the things that is interesting is that I've done a lot of research on the web, and you can find lists of accidents that happened in this particular jet my uncle flew, which was a Northrop F-89 Scorpion fighter
Mhm.
interceptor.
How
It's a
long do they
plane.
keep that in service for? Do you know?
Okay, let's see. As I said, the prototype flew in 1948. I think the first plane started arriving at the squadrons, and I think 1951 or 52. And what happened was after it quickly became uh, out of date, and they gave it to the National Guard. And I think the National Guard actually flew it until 1969, which is really a long time.
Yeah, it's a long time.
Yeah,
It's like almost
but
20 years.
it is, and I forget my train of thought. I'm sorry. Could you repeat your question again? I got lost a little bit.
I don't know what we're talking about, and I'm joking. What was my question? We were talking about when they phased it out.
Oh yes,
In
yes, yeah. No,
1969.
I'm sorry.
What's the answer?
I thought you asked me something before then. I apologize. Yeah, but it was around for a long time. But and nothing is interesting about the technology. I mean, maybe it's the same today. I don't know. But the jet technology was advancing so quick then that they would get a contract to make the plane, and pretty much by the time they had, what's the word? Not outfitted. By the time they had, a full complement of the planes serving the squadron, there was already a new technology come along which completely made the other one obsolete, and they're already working on the next jet.
It's very interesting too, because I wondered also while you were talking about the flyboy mentality also of the Air Force at this time. I mean, do you have like Top Gun syndrome happening? Because I mean, it was like enlisted during World War II, and this is 4 years after or so. So that would be like the first generation of officer pilots. Do they have that gung ho attitude?
Well, I have done quite a bit of reading of memoirs of pilots at the time, and there certainly is that I have to be careful about way I put this because I don't want to sound negative, but kind of like the alpha male fighter pilot thing, that's definitely there, you know. And I don't necessarily mean that in a bad way because I think that if you're going to get in that plane and risk your life, you kind of have to be that type of person
Yeah.
because most people wouldn't. You know what I mean? You got to have that type of confidence. I think that if you have even the slightest bit of hesitation and think that you're not the best, if you don't think you're the best of the best, you could easily die because if you panic, if you get scared, you're in trouble. You know what I mean? The thing with these guys, I from what I read have in common, and I'm sure that the same thing is true today. You got to have ice water in your brains.
Yeah,
Your
you really
your brain
do. And you
side.
have to be like resolute, don't you, as well? Because
You
you're
do.
gonna be spending hours on top of many tons of munition.
Absolutely. And
You're gonna
my
take
uncle's
life.
plane was nuclear armed too, which is rather interesting. That's one thing a lot of people don't know. He flew in a jet that if it came to it and war was going to happen, his jet was nuclear armed, and the idea was what they would do is they would do a snap up attack. They would kind of jerk the plane up and shoot a nuke up there, and in theory, a whole formation of Soviet bombers would just disintegrate in the sky. So it was a big deal. I mean, not many people know that we had nuclear armed jets, and during the Cuban Missile Crisis, they had these jets flying dispersed all around the country. So we actually had nuclear weapons flying all over our skies in America during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Not many people know that. Thank God, not one of them crashed, because who knows what might have happened.
I hear that it would have been okay. That's what I
Well,
hear.
you're right. There were fail safes. That's true. There were fail safes, but I know at
I
least
hear
one
it could have
case.
survived like multiple crashes from the sky and been okay. Because it takes like that trigger on the inside for it to go, and that is special. I don't know.
You're
But
right, but
yeah,
I
it's
do know
scary
of
as fuck.
one case, though. I do know of one case when I forget. You probably know better than I do as a military person, but there's a sequence of things that have to happen where they're like that are supposed to stop an unwanted detonation. And there was one case when they had a B-52 crash, and the top three layers of the fail-safe uh, things that were supposed to stop a detonation didn't work, and luckily the last one stopped. That we would have had on American soil an accidental detonation, and who knows how many people would have died. But you're right. There was just that one time when we were close to an accident.
That's a very familiar story, and I did not know that the failsafes had failed that close to catastrophe.
Only
Where did it
once.
crash at?
I don't remember, but I do remember finding online there's a declassified study done. I think it was by the Air Force on nuclear accidents
Oh,
and
that's right. It
completely
was a
going to.
secret for like decades,
It
wasn't it?
was exactly. It was. They finally released it. Yeah,
Like, hey guys, we crashed a plane with a nuclear bomb, but it was okay. It didn't go off.
it was okay.
Man, the idea of what is it? What is the place in Japan that's currently radioactive because of the earthquake and the tsunami that hit it?
Oh yeah, I don't
Tsunami,
remember. I know what you mean.
tsunami, something like that. And then the place in Russia, Chernobyl, that you can't
Chernobyl.
go to. I mean, the idea of this technology is outlandish. What it could do, and we have it at our disposal. And it's what kept the peace, isn't it? I mean, many people have died, millions of people have died, but not by nuclear annihilation, by stupid warfare.
I think you're very right, Bryan. I think that something that occurred to me a while ago, and I kicked myself because someone else beat me to it because they published it first. I really believe the people who are responsible for the atomic weapons should get the Nobel Peace Prize. I know that sounds crazy, but I don't think it's a coincidence that we haven't had a world war since we've had atomic and then nuclear weapons, because nowadays everyone knows that if we have a world war, everyone loses. That's why
Yeah.
we don't have one. So the people want to get rid of nuclear weapons. Bad idea, because if we do that, then we'll have World War II again, because people will go through the foolish notion of thinking, oh, I can win a war again because I don't have to worry about my country being by a nuclear weapon.
I write science fiction. I write about the future. I write about technology and things like that. As a historian, where do you think we're going to go? Where do you think our country, where do you think our world is heading?
Okay, the world. I don't think it's a good place. I'm not positive. I
Well,
think
I mean, that's not a positive statement. So,
I know it's kind of pessimistic. I have a young daughter. I wonder what, I guess, her grandchildren are going to see.
yeah, I'm worried about my kids, what they're going to see.
Right, you have young kids too. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't think. I think in a lot of ways things are not getting better. I think that in some way our standard of living is declining. I think that I hate to be a downer. I don't see it go. I think in some ways at least the United States, our high point was a while back, even though we weren't far from perfect at the time. I think we've been generally on a downward slide, and I don't
A
see
lot
it
of
getting
people
any
feel like
better.
that. We were at the highest we ever were after World War II. Do you agree? The 50s, maybe,
I would
60s,
actually, I'll
early
tell you what I think. I
60s.
think the moment Oswald pulled the trigger, I think that was when we started on the downward slope. I mean, I know back then there was terrible stuff, because I know obviously African Americans didn't have rights, and that's all horrible. I understand that, but overall, I think that it's been pretty much on a downward end since then. That's just my opinion. I know I hate to be negative on your show, but that's just how I see it.
Well, just our country, but 1963, LBJ. I mean, what? It's just like a lot of questions, right? But we were
Yeah,
already lying to ourselves at that point. We were what, 15 years out of World War II, maybe a little bit more.
right.
We just murdered and we killed so many people, dropping these horrible, horrible bombs on them. We had to have known that we're doing it.
Yeah, we'll see. Even that, though, I have to respectfully disagree with you a little bit on that one, because I actually think when we dropped the atomic bombs on Japan, I think overall we actually saved uh, both a lot of American and Japanese lives. Because I know that if you look, you can find some really great archival footage where the Japanese military was training
Yeah,
people in
I've
the
heard this
country.
before. Absolutely, 100%. That war would have crawled along
It would
for a
have been
very, very long
bad. It
time.
would have been bad. It would have been a bloodbath. The Japanese civilians, I mean, they would have been fighting with rakes and hoes. I think that, I mean, it's so sad that those people died in the blast, but I think overall, both Japanese and American lives were actually saved by the bomb. And I know that my wife's uncle told me an interesting story. He was on a destroyer in World War II, and he said that yeah, I think it was an intelligence officer. He said that night before the bomb dropped, he was studying the invasion plans, and he said that his ship was going to be in the first wave in the attack, and he's 100% certain that he would have been dead, if we hadn't dropped the bomb and had tried to invade Japan. So I, although the suffering, obviously, as a human being, the suffering makes you want to cry, but I think overall,
What if history is one of my favorite genres of all time, right? And that's what we're doing here. What we're saying is, what if we didn't drop the bombs? What would have happened? But at the end of the day, we did drop the bombs.
right,
Japan didn't drop the bombs. Germany
true,
didn't. Russia didn't. We did.
you're right,
If it had been on the different, if like, let's say Einstein's so important to this story, right?
right.
Let's say Einstein goes to Russia instead of America for whatever reason, and they end up with the bomb. I mean, it still gets dropped, right? It still causes devastation and it causes a different world at the end of the day.
It does, and you know
What's
what,
his face?
Brian? Sorry, go ahead.
Kennedy died because they're still trying to control that bomb. He died because somebody else decided they had a better idea on how to control that bomb. I mean, that's the conspiracy, right? Or was a crazy lunatic that was desperate to be a part of the Soviet Union. Whichever way you want to look at it, it's still about the bomb, isn't it? In a way, that's my opinion. I think it's about that blowing as many people or scaring people that you can blow them up or
I
controlling
think you're
it.
right. I think you're right, because I think that the Cold War was definitely tied into why I believe Oswald did what he did. So I think you're 100% right. But I think the interesting thing about that, as I read an Air Force historian who wrote about nuclear weapons, and what he said is that he was writing about the time between when we had it before the Soviets got it, and he said, based on his research, he said it's the only time in history that a country had an overwhelmingly dominant weapon, and we never used it to try to take over another country and territorial expansion, which I think really speaks well for us for a country. And I think, getting to your point, Bryan, I think if the Soviets had it, I think they would have used it to try to take over the world, and we didn't. So I'm gonna cheer for us that we did the right thing in that instance.
That we were first anyway.
Right, but also that we didn't use it. I mean, we could have used it to try to take over the world because we had a monopoly. I mean, if we could have blackmailed the whole world saying, do what we want or I'll drop this bomb on you, and we didn't do it,
Didn't we do that though? We dropped it tons. You can go on YouTube and type in nuclear bomb tests and you could find the footage, right? I mean, it was out there. People knew about it.
You mean the threat? Yeah.
The threat, right? I mean, we're obviously not blowing people up. I mean, my step-grandfather was at the Bikini Island when they were doing their testing. He died of brain cancer. So we potentially were killing ourselves with the radiation. I mean, I hear horrible stories about that.
That's sad.
We destroyed that entire population of that atoll. They had to be relocated. The cancer rates were ridiculous, even like 2-3 generations later. I mean, the casualties are amazing from this Cold War, right? Vietnam,
right.
Korea, Iraq, Saddam, Iran. I mean, damn, the bomb didn't get dropped, but everything was about it. Even the second Iraq war was about the bomb, dirty bombs, making sure they didn't have it, keeping Iran in the Stone Age, and Korea. I mean, everything since 1940. When did it get dropped? 1945?
It sounds right. Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. It's interesting, right? Everything.
You're right.
Your uncle's life was cost by that bomb. The bomb being dropped.
You're right.
Had to have that fast-ass technology to get there. Get that bomb over Russia immediately. Doesn't matter. We'll get rid of that navigator if we need to, because we need to get there fast. And that sucks.
You make good points.
It's interesting. I mean, where are we at now? It's 2018. And we're still very concerned about that bomb.
Yeah,
are we?
I do, and I think we should be, because I don't want to get rid of it. I know that people call me horrible, but as I said, I'm just afraid that if we do that, we'll just be back to conventional war, and maybe
turn to the Bible for that, right? Pandora's box. You opened it. You're sorry, you're stuck with it now. You have it for the rest of your, I don't know, awareness of history. I mean, you had the Pandora's box is open, the bugs are free, or whatever was in there, and now you have to deal with repercussions of it.
Well,
and you're right, man. That technology is amazing because it sent us to the moon. It sent us freaking past Pluto. I mean, it sent us into the space between stars. I mean, damn, man, that's the most miraculous thing ever.
You're right. You make very good points.
It's incredible. I mean, yeah, man, you talk about writing about your uncle. It's an incredibly interesting story that he was a part of, that this 22-year-old dude who lost his life, what he was fighting for, putting robots on Mars.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's a good story. It's just, and the other thing that's interesting is that what I discovered is that because that period between Korea and Vietnam, very little has been written about that. Not a lot of people know about it, and I'm hoping that people will want to read it just because it's kind of a mystery to people. I mean, what the heck was going on with people in the military between that time? And we had a lot, like as you know, there was still a draft, for heaven's sake, going on. People were still going to the military. They had no choice. They went in there. So it's
ruined careers, right? Muhammad Ali was a part of not taking that, saying no to the draft. I'm not going to be a part of that military machine.
He did.
Elvis Presley went the other way. I mean, man, it's so interesting. You had a choice to destroy your life or destroy your life. I mean, there was really no options otherwise. You're going to be mauled by this machine, or you're going to be mauled by the criminal justice machine. There's no other choice.
I guess that's one way to look at it. Yeah.
I read the most interesting thing. We're working on about an hour, so I'm gonna wrap it up with you. But I read the most interesting thing about life the other day, and how in the past human culture was very geared towards eternity after death. very much so in terms of spirituality. So they would send their troops into battle because they knew if they died, they would go to heaven. And in modern day, kind of the atheistic movements come to more common ground, and giving life away like that is not as appealing. So we try as hard as we possibly can not to forfeit the lives, because we know this is precious and special, and this is probably the only place it's going to exist that we'll know of.
That's interesting. But isn't it true, as someone serving in the military yourself, Bryan, that they say that soldiers' motivation really is your buddies in your unit more than anything else? And if you are going to give up your life, it's really for your buddies in your unit rather than an abstract concept.
It's hard to say. I mean, I didn't serve in combat,
I
so
know
I
you're
didn't
right.
have to
You're
have
right.
that
Right.
experience. But I mean, I know what it's like to be surrounded by men who you don't necessarily want to be surrounded by. That
Right.
you didn't
Right.
say, I want to be with that dude and that dude and that dude.
Right.
You know, it's
It's
like
like
you're
being
being
in
told.
prison, right?
It's like being in prison with like 12
Yeah.
other dudes who don't want to be there anyway, who will try their hardest to get out of the work that they're being assigned, and you don't know whether or not they'll do what they said they're going to do
I'm
until you're
sorry I'm
tested.
laughing, but that's funny.
It's very, I mean, we're all, you're not, I mean, I was there. I know who my unit
Right.
was made out of. They're not the
Right.
cream of the crop. You know what I mean?
Right.
They're
Right.
not the
Right. Right.
PhD candidates going, I want to serve my country on the front lines of combat. You know,
Right.
I have engineering degree and I want to be a truck driver in the army. You know, you're not going to get the best.
No,
You're going to
you're
get the
right.
dude that doesn't have a lot of options, who 3 days after his high school graduation thinks he's signing up for Adventureland like I was. You
Right.
know, just
Right.
get me out of here. I want to join the army. I don't care what my job is. I
Right.
mean, that was me. And there's a lot of others like that. And they're not patriotic and they don't care other than give me adventure. Let me have a college education. Let me see the world. Um, what is this shovel in my hand and why am I filling sandbags? Basically, is how you'll spend 4 years.
That's fascinating insight. You should write about your experience. I know you're a fiction writer, Bryan, but everything you just told me was fascinating for someone like me to hear who didn't serve. I wonder if you'd ever write about something like that.
There's tons of books out there. I mean, of this experience of being a soldier, right?
Right.
And I do kind of take it from the science fiction, speculative fantasy side of things, because I mean, I don't want to write autobiographical stuff because I'm going to lie, right? And you don't want to get caught in a lie.
That's true.
You might make one mistake, and then it'll be the one mistake that somebody calls you out on and says, "Hey, that's so cool. Tell me more about it." And you can't not tell them about it. You know what I mean?
Well, that's
Everyone's
why up
careers.
to now I've only written about dead people, so no one can do that. This is the first. My book on my uncle is the first thing I'll be commenting on people who are alive, and it's very tricky because the pilot of my uncle's plane is still living. So I have to
Oh,
consult with my brother, who's an attorney, about how I'm going to handle that one, being that he flew the plane into the water.
military fiction, man. You could play around in the speculative genre, do some historical fantasy or something. I mean, there's so many ways you can go with that story. I mean, it's really amazing.
Perhaps, but you know
Um,
what it is? I tip my hat to you because I don't have the fiction ability. I think it's much harder to get published in fiction than it is nonfiction. I mean, I wrote periodicals for a long time. I had my first book out, and I know it's a lot harder to do what you do than what I do.
yeah, I don't know. I know it's impressive to get published. When you do actually do, it feels good.
It
You
does,
know,
doesn't
if
it?
every time you
It
send something
does.
out, they gave you a yes, it'd be like, yeah,
It'd be easy,
yeah,
right?
yeah, it's nothing special. I got published again, but man, when you get a yes, it's the best feeling.
It's great. But you know what, Bryan? We never get a chance to talk about my true crime book. Can we cover that a little bit towards the
You
end
know
of the
what?
interview?
Let me ask you about your true crime book. What's the gist and where can we find it? Because we're wrapping up, and I want to ask you two more questions before we finish.
Sure. Okay.
What's your true? I mean, it's available right now on Amazon, right?
It's everywhere ebooks are sold. It's only
Okay.
available in ebook format. My publisher is Popular Media. That's Pulpular Media. The title is "What the Little Dog Witnessed: The True Crime of Ed Hubbard and Willie Roberts," and it's actually part of a true crime ebook series. It's number 11, called $2 Terrors, but it's only $1.99. And I'll just read a quick summary. My publisher came up with some great a summary of the book, and I'll get
Okay.
into it real quick. It says, career convict and con artist Ed Hubbard and his accomplice Willie Roberts, a young and attractive prostitute, set out to play a long game against the farmer Pless Burns, who owned a spread on the Spring River in Arkansas. But Willie grows tired of waiting and pressures Hubbard to fix the old man. Even with a backstory of multiple marriages, extramarital affairs, an incompetent judge, an extremely messy divorce, a death sentence, 2 jailbreaks, incest, a connection to one of the most infamous criminal gangs of the 1930s, 3 murders, a terrible miscarriage of justice, and 2 sensational murder trials, the most fascinating part of the story is an amazing and heroic canine.
What era are we writing in here?
It's pardon me. The crime took place in 1905, and the last of the criminal proceedings connected with ended in early 1906.
Missouri.
Arkansas.
Arkansas, okay. 1905 Arkansas, man. That does not sound like a fun place to be living at.
A lot of poverty. A lot of
A lot of
poverty. I think
poverty.
that plays an important part of my story because I think that's why played into the murder happened, because you had a case where a prostitute convincing a wealthy elderly widow into an arrangement where he would move in with him. She would take care of him. He would eventually divorce his estranged wife and make him his heir. But what happened was he changed his will, and the prostitute got tired of waiting for nature to take his course and conspired with her boyfriend to drown the old man. And that's the murder at the center of my story.
So what's up with the dog? Or can you go into that? Or do you
Well,
have to read the story?
yeah, I can. I don't want to ruin it, but basically, what happened was the dog witnessed his murder, his master being murdered, tried to save him, and then actually helped convict him. And I knew when I heard about this story that true crime is very hot. I know most people love animals and true stories about animals. I figure if I put them both together, I'd have a story that people will love, and it's worked out very well for me.
Well, that's cool, man. So the other authors of the other 10 books, all different? Or are there some duplicates? Can we expect to see your name thrown into this $2? What is it? $2 Tales of Horror?
$2 Terra. $2 Terra.
Terror.
Yes, I would. Well, actually, I'm actually the second author to write for the series, and I actually would like to write another one after I finish my book on my uncle, because I have I've done some work with death inquest files here in Massachusetts, and I've come across some really good stories that I would like to uh, write about in another work such as this. So in the future, absolutely.
Man, I've been thinking about the pilots that went down with George Bush at the tail end of the Pacific Theater, and they were captured by Japanese and cannibalized on an island, would make a fantastic $2 tale of terror.
Well, absolutely. My publisher is actively seeking manuscripts, both nonfiction and fiction. And if you like details, Bryan, I'll be happy to send them
Yeah,
along.
hook me up. Is it always open submissions, or is it by invitation only?
No, it's open submissions. There's I'll send you the website. He just wants a
Oh, I was looking at it
synopsis.
before we got on the phone.
Yeah,
Before
okay,
we got on the
definitely.
Hangouts.
I would definitely take a shot. It's a tiny independent press, but they've been really nice to me, and they've promised what they delivered, and I've been very happy with it because
Interesting.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just complimenting you what you were saying. Interesting.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, definitely. I would give it a shot. I'll definitely let you know, and I'll
Um,
definitely recommend you.
let's sum up what we've talked about. I like to ask a couple questions, being the first. Dude, what's the hardest thing about writing true crime for you? When coming across these stories and getting them out to people, what's the hardest thing about producing this stuff?
Well, in my case, what I faced was most true crime are modern crimes. And my book is what you call historic true crime because
Mm-hmm.
it happened back in 1905. And what I didn't have, something I couldn't take advantage of, was a large amount of official records that have survived for the crime. Most true crime writers say they can get into the criminal files and dig into the court records. All that stuff was gone. It's all who knows what happened, disposed, burned up in a fire. But
Oh
I
yeah,
didn't.
St. Louis went down in flames. Honestly, that's what I heard just recently. My records are gone. I can't
Oh
find
yeah,
my
that
stuff either.
you talking about the St. Louis in the
Yeah.
facility, and you're right. Well, that's my uncle's personnel file in the same fire. Bryan was all burned up, which is so sad. But luckily, my family saved all my uncle's copies of those records, so I
Oh,
have
good.
all that stuff. Yeah, but you're right, it's all gone. So for me, the biggest challenge I had to face was how am I going to write the story when all the the records are gone? And what I did mainly was I found heavily researched into the newspapers of the period, and this crime was covered all over the country. It was read by people in every region of the country, and I did a lot of hard work digging up the details in the newspapers of the period. So that was a big challenge I had to overcome in getting the story. But I think it worked out well, and I think I wrote a engaging narrative that's fun to read.
And what's most important to you? I did ask what's the hardest part, right? I asked two
Yeah,
questions: the hardest, and then what's most important.
I mean the most important aspect of my book,
Just writing in general, getting these
or
stories out,
writing in
what you're
general.
doing, like the creativity in general.
Well, I was asked by another interviewer, why write? And I think the answer is that I think everything we do in our lives is predicated upon communication. So my advice to writers is don't worry about publication and write anyway.
Right.
And the
Yeah, I
reason why
read
I
your
say
quote. That was interesting. So you were talking about communication being the most important part of the writing process.
I do because I think that every time you write, it just makes you better at writing, and that makes you a better communicator. And every single goal we
I
have in
totally
our
agree.
lives, we can accomplish by being better communicators. So I say, a lot of people get hung up on publication. Don't do that. I mean, I've been lucky enough to do it. You have too, Bryan, but not everyone has. Don't worry about that. Just write because it makes you better at accomplishing your life goals. So we should all write.
You
That
gauge
that
yourself a little better though when you get those yeses,
it
right? I
does
mean,
feel good.
you
It
send
doesn't
stuff out
suck.
like
Yeah,
you don't know what this feels like, but when you get a no, it challenges you to work harder and be better.
I agree with
And
you. I agree with
when you
you.
get those yeses, it's like it's just confirming what you already knew anyway, that you were a genius and somebody finally recognized it.
Well, that's another question. If you might have seen one of the interviews I did, someone asked me about ego in writing, and I said everyone who writes has an ego. For me to think that anyone in the world gives a rat's butt about any word I write, you got to have an ego, right?
Right.
So if we're all honest, we all have an ego, or we wouldn't be writing.
You really do. I mean, I wake up in the morning knowing I need to write a story, and it feels good to write it. But honestly, I'm writing it because I want to give it away to people. You never asked me
Exactly.
for it to begin with. You know what I mean? Well, that takes balls.
You're
I'm like,
right. Exactly.
here's this thing you never wanted, and I'm going to give it to you, and you're going to
I'm
pay me
with
for
you.
it.
I totally agree.
My last question for you, Patrick, is what are you consuming right now, as far as media goes? Books, television series, movies that you'd recommend people check out?
Okay. I'm really enjoying podcasts a lot. I think what makes them so great is that there's no middlemen and middle women that are,
Yeah, I
you
agree.
know,
That's one
just
of my
like
favorite
your show.
parts.
Like your show. I mean, you're a creative person, Bryan. You're delivering content, pardon me, straight to the public. You don't have someone who's a business person, which I mean, I'm not putting them down. We need business people. That's how the country runs. But business people generally aren't creative people. There's no one censoring you, controlling you, telling you what to do. So people like you are producing really fun content. And so I love what you're doing. I love what podcasters are doing. I know your show is a podcast and a webcast. I know. I love that. That's something that's really important to me because I want to enjoy the work from creative people without suits, as I say, in between censoring people and
Yeah,
telling me what's good. You know?
those commercials. That's what drives me crazy the most.
Oh, they're horrible.
Oh,
They're horrible. They're horrible. And yeah, they're absolutely awful. That's what I love about the DVR. I just fast forward right through those babies. I'm not
I
watching them.
gave up the DVR too. I cut cable out completely. I just can't stand it.
It's useless. You know what it is?
Yeah,
I like college football. It's the only reason why I still have cable because I gotta watch college football.
and you struggle to watch sports. I have not seen the Olympics. The Summer Olympics in Brazil, was not able to watch any of it,
Oh
and
wow,
the Winter Olympics, I just gave up. Um,
wow.
and football, it's easier to watch the games live, but I mean, it's not going to be the best quality. Still, sports, it hurts. It really does, unfortunately.
Yeah, what are you
Just I
gonna
do
do?
not want the commercials, man. I do not. I hate them so much.
I agree. And another show. Speaking of podcasts, it's also an Amazon show. I enjoy the show Lore. Are you familiar with that?
No. Oh yeah, maybe I am. Tell me a little bit more about it.
How do I explain it? It's kind. He goes into some. I got to phrase this carefully. What I like about the show is the episodes when he goes into that true life historic stories. Pardon me, that have a creepy aspect to them. Like he does like he covers Burke and Hare, the body snatchers. Some of it, what I don't like is when he gets into basically urban legends. And I'm too old for fairy tales, so I don't want my time wasted. I hate to sound like obnoxious, but the thing that bothers me a little bit is that early on in the show, he'd have a statement saying, every word you're about to hear is true. And then he'd tell a story about an account of a werewolf in France. Now, obviously, we know werewolves aren't true. So we know, even though he's reading, he can say, I have a source of someone who made a parish priest who wrote this account of werewolf. Well, obviously, werewolves are not free. So don't tell me every word I'm about to hear is true and tell me a story about werewolf. What you do is, the way you handle that story is you read the account, and then you get into the scholars and you say, well, this was probably a bear, or this person was hallucinating from bad grain and stuff like that. So I have mixed feelings about the show, but overall it's done really well, and I would recommend it, even though it's a little annoying because I think he is kind of exploiting people a little bit there by telling them this is a true story and telling them about vampires. But
Yeah,
anyway.
it's very interesting. Fargo is a television series on USA. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not.
I've heard it, and I know I should watch it. The movie is one of my favorite movies of all time.
Yeah, the series is really fantastic as well. I think there's 4 seasons out, and they're anthologies, so they change characters every season. And starts out with that statement: everything that follows is a true story. The names have been changed to protect the innocent, and blah 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 blah. But it's completely fiction.
Yeah, which is blunt. Well, like the movie Sleepers, right? It was a great movie. I know it was a great book, but it was exploitive to say this is a true story, because it wasn't.
Yeah.
But it was still a great novel and a great
They
movie.
truly are, though, man. They're all lies, right?
They are.
It's all like contextual.
Very much so.
Man, this has been a fantastic conversation. I'm really, really happy that I got you to come on.
Well, you've been a great interviewer, Bryan. I had so much fun speaking to you. It's great to talk to a really smart guy who has a lot on his mind. It didn't even seem like an interview. It just seemed like having a chat with a friend over a couple of beers.
Yeah, that's what I'm not in for anything. I just kind of talk from the hip and see where we end up. I've had some awkward conversations. I had one guy tell me, what's going on here?
You did, really?
You're not asking me any questions.
Well, see, that's what I like about your show. It's kind of organic, and it just kind of goes whatever feels natural. You're a really good interviewer. You're fun to talk to, and I'd be honored to be on your show again. I will definitely keep that in mind. Yeah, we'll definitely, as long as you'll have me, I'd love to do this again. Thank you very much, Bryan. You have a wonderful night, and again, I'm honored to be on your show. I had a lot of fun.